All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Susan Kung, and I feel a little weird because I'm so short that I can't see the people on that side of the room from the screen. So this workshop is being recorded. I just wanted to let you all know that up front. I understand that some of you might not have realized that anything in these high-tech rooms were being recorded, but I think a lot of stuff is being recorded. So anyone who is not registered for the LSA, who has not signed the celebrity release form yet? Anybody who has not signed it yet? No? Okay, good. All right, so our intention is to create a deliverable for NSF because this workshop is being sponsored. It was funded by NSF and it's sponsored by NSF. And so eventually we will have the slides and maybe the lectures posted online. We do not intend to have images of you all online, but at this point we don't know what the video product is going to look like. And so if you do see images of yourself online, I'll go ahead and say right now that it's not our intention to put you online, but it might be unavoidable. So if anybody has a problem with that, anybody? Okay, good. So everybody, that means that everybody who's here is present and accounted for, and they're not hiding out from anybody, and right, they're not on the run or in witness protection. Okay, good. So today, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce my oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm progressing slides from the wrong direction. So we're going to pass the microphone. We're each going to introduce ourselves, and since I started, I'll go ahead and do that first. My name is Susan Kung, and I am the manager and archivist at the Archive of the Indigenous Languages of Latin America. I'll say that again, the Archive of the Indigenous Languages of Latin America at the University of Texas at Austin. And I read a lot of data management plans because I do a lot of archiving of data that has been collected under NSF grants and NEH grants. And I won't take anybody's data unless they let me read their data management plan first, because I want to make sure that they're giving me some data that I can actually handle. And so that's how I got involved in this particular workshop about writing data management plans. I've written a few data management plans. I've gotten a few grants myself, but I have a lot of experience reading data management plans more than anything else. I'm also a linguist. I have a PhD in linguistics. I did documentary linguistics before I became an archivist. And I was an early archiver of all my data. When I went into the field in 2000 to start my field work, I went in with archiving on my consent form. So I got people's permission at the outset of my interview to put their data into an archive when I was done. And so we'll talk a little bit about doing that as the day progresses. I'm going to pass the microphone to my colleague, Andrea. So a little bit of noise here.
After this morning session, we won't be switching the microphone around so much.
Right.
Okay.
And in order to record the voices, we have to have the microphone.
Through the mic, yeah. So, hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Andrea Berez-Kroeker. I'm also a linguist. I'm a professor at the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa, where I teach in our graduate program in language documentation and conservation. I'm also an archivist, sort of an erstwhile archivist. I'm also the director of a small archive at the University of Hawaiʻi that is part of our university's library system. The archive is called Kaipuleohone, which is Hawaiian for a gourd of sweet-sounding words. So a gourd is a storage device for sweet words. And like Susan, I also have a background in documentary linguistics. I've done a lot of fieldwork in Alaska and in Papua New Guinea, and also I was an early archiver as well when I was a student. When I was a master's student, I was part of the eMeld project, which some of you who are a little older may remember. It was an early project to develop standards for data preservation in linguistics. And I'm also currently the PI on a couple of projects to increase the level of education to our linguistics colleagues about the care of data, preservation of linguistic data. And so this workshop grows out of that. I think that's all that's relevant right now. I'll pass the microphone on to Lauren. Okay.
Gotta find something to clip the microphone to. That's the part I'm here. Okay, so hi everybody. I am Lauren Collister. I come from the University of Pittsburgh to you today. I am a little different from my co-presenters. I am a sociolinguist, PhD in sociolinguistics, and I am currently a scholarly communications librarian at the University of Pittsburgh, which means I deal with copyright, open access, open data, author rights, and other various topics for the university and beyond. I am part of the Committee on Scholarly Communication and Linguistics for the LSA, and I also work with SPARC, the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, which is a lobbying group in Washington, D.C., working on copyright, author rights, etc. My sociolinguistics background is in ethnography, and I did my field work on the internet. I studied group of LGBT World of Warcraft players and looked at how their language reinforced the boundaries of their community against the outer community of gamers. I'm here today because I'm an expert on copyright and intellectual property, and that comes from my issues with my data set, which you'll hear about after lunch today. I will tell you the story. And I'm also, as Andrea said to me earlier, that I'm kind of here to provide a little bit of a different view, because I know not everybody in here comes from a documentary linguistics background, so I'm the token sociolinguist on the presenting panel. That's all that's relevant for right now, but if you have any questions about my job or how to find somebody like me at your institution, I will be happy to tell you all about that. Okay, now it's stuck to me here.
Okay, so the aims for this workshop today are to understand what a DMP, or data management plan, is and why it's important. And we also want you to understand the components of a DMP, because in order to write a good one, you need to understand what it is you need to write about. And to learn where to fill in the gaps in our knowledge, because we don't know everything there is to know about the type of research that you do or what might be relevant to your research. But we can hopefully help you find people who can. And ultimately, we want you to draft a DMP during this workshop. It can be real or it can be an imaginary project for your own linguistics project. So if you already have a project in mind, raise your hand so we have an idea. Okay. And if you are going to make up a project during this class, yeah? Okay, good. So that's about half, not quite half and half. More people have a project than not. And so if you are going to make up a project, this is still a really good exercise to do, because after you've gone through these steps, then when it's time to draft your own actual project, you'll have a better understanding of what you need to do. So what this workshop is not, it's not a class on basic data collection. This work is not a basic class on data management. We are going to be talking about data management, but we are not actually teaching you how to manage your data. However, we will remind you of digital best practices, and we'll show you how to describe your plans for digital data to satisfy the DMP.
Oops, this is me. Okay. I suppose this is me, huh? All right, it's me again. So we have a little code of conduct here. I know you guys signed one for the whole Linguistic Institute, but in here, because we're going to be working on data management for your actual data projects, some of which might be sensitive or you might be concerned about sharing, we just wanted to lay a little bit of groundwork for this. So basically what I'm saying here is that for the terms of this particular workshop, we include in the definition of harassment from the broader code of conduct that you signed, the deliberate scooping or stealing of ideas from your colleagues without express written agreement and appropriate attribution. You can read the whole thing. There's an entire code of conduct that this was borrowed from in the Google Drive folder. You can read the whole thing. It's from a conference called OpenCon that I work with. But this is the part that we would like you guys to know about for this particular part of the workshop. Okay. If you guys have any questions about that, by the way, reporting info, if you feel uncomfortable if something happens or whatever goes on in this workshop, not that we expect anything bad to happen, but if you have any questions about it, please talk to me. I'm happy to talk to you about it. anytime. And my contact information, email, etc., is in the Google Drive folder about this. Okay, so now we have a schedule. It's still me. Oh, ha. Okay, so we have a schedule. We have 7 what we call information sessions. And we've broken the schedule up into about blocks of an hour, where we'll have an information session that goes about 30 minutes, and then a work session where we're going to ask you to actually put into practice and write about some of the things that we've talked about in the information session. And this would be you applying the knowledge you've just gained to your project or your hypothetical project. These are the 7 sections. These are roughly in order. We're going to start with the overview of DMPs, which is what we're going to do right after this, and then to go to data collection, and then we'll have a lunch break, and then legal and ethical considerations afterwards, and then backup and storage. So, and then we'll have plenty of time for lunch, and we'll be around. We have plenty of time for questions. We can talk if you have questions or thoughts or want to talk it out for your particular project. Happy to do it. And then at the end of day 2 in the afternoon, we're going to have a writing revision session and peer review, because peer reviewing data management plans is something that's very important, and learning from your peers can be something that is very instructional. Here's the actual schedule with times, so you can see what you're getting into for this. As you can see, we're right now in the overview, and we'll have a little 15-minute break after this for you to get up, stretch your legs, chat with each other, etc. Then we'll continue on. This schedule is also available in the folder. Okay, you've seen I've mentioned the Google Drive folder as I've been standing here, and I want to tell you a little bit about what's in there. Our slides are in there. That code of conduct I just talked about is in there. Schedule is in there. We also have a document that is for your working sessions. Oh, is Andrea going to show us what's actually in there? We have a document for your working sessions, and this contains all the questions, framing questions that we've given you to do this part of your data management plan. We would like you to make a copy of this document, not edit it directly in that document, because if everybody's adding their own stuff in the same document, it can get confusing. So please go ahead and make a copy. Andrea is showing you how to do that right now, and then you'll have your own version to work from without anything getting muddled. We also have a collaborative note-taking document for everybody, so if you would like to join in, because there's a lot of information that's going to be handed out today, and everybody's going to take something different away, so please feel free to come in here, do some collaborative class notes, add some of your own takeaways, your own ideas into this document. Please go for it. And also in that folder, we have some helpful readings. There's a whole folder of these that have been selected by us, your instructors, as readings that may provide additional information or insight into some of the things that we're talking about. We will occasionally refer to some of these as we go along, and they're all here in the folder for you. I think that's everything in the folder. Any questions so far? Everybody can get to the folder? Everybody's good? It's really weird to have to turn around and talk behind me. Okay, good. Okay, next up.
So a data management plan is a written document, and this outlines how your data will be handled. So the handling of the data includes collecting the data, describing the data, organizing, processing, and analyzing the data, preserving the data, and sharing it after your project is over. All of the data that you collect has to be managed. Not everything has to be shared, okay? And you also need to think of your data in terms of short-term care and long-term care, okay? Because nowadays, a lot of research is funded by NSF. Well, at least it has been. We'll see what the future holds for NSF and NEH. But the funding agencies have put a lot of taxpayer dollars into these grants. And now it would be nice if the taxpayers got to see the results of the work. And so that's the big push for sharing data. A data management plan includes detailed procedures for data collection. It also includes all aspects of the organization and processing before your data leaves your lab or your field site or whatever location it was created in. And it includes a plan to have the data leave your lab or your field site so that others can find it and access it forevermore, or for as long as the digital age lasts, with proper attention to legal and ethical concerns. And because a lot of data do have legal and ethical concerns. Do we have any questions up to this point? No? Okay, good.
Okay, this is the last changeover of
This is the last
speakers.
changeover,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need data management plans. Has anyone ever written a data management plan before? We didn't ask that. A few people have. Okay, all right. So some of this may be a bit of a review, but it's important to think about why data management plans are so important these days. I mean, pragmatically, for you, it's because it'll allow you to get money to do your research, right? So it's about convincing your funder that you understand how to handle your data. But the reason it's a concern in the digital age is because digital data really do have some problems with longevity. Some of you may have thought about this before, but some of you may not have. So the way I see the problems with digital data, there's 3 central problems that we need to solve regarding digital data. These are the media problem, the format problem, and the storage and access problem. And I'll go through those briefly, right? So the media problem is this. It's the idea that the more advanced our technology becomes, the more ephemeral it is, right? So hard drives last approximately 5 years, and then you have to migrate your data onto a new hard drive. I'm guessing that most people don't actually do that, so you should do it. If you have some old hard drives sitting around, you should migrate your data to a new one. The technology just prior to that, we were putting everything on CDs and DVDs, and those last about 10 years. Before that, it was things like cassette tapes and analog media like that. Those last 30 years or so, provided you can put them in a nice, dry, temperature-controlled environment. Before that, everything was on paper. Paper lasts 100 to 200 years or more, depending on where it is. And of course, stone tablets, which I guess came before paper, last forever until they're destroyed. And I guess at the top of this bullet-pointed list, I should put things like thumb drives, because those last just as long as you can manage to not lose them or wash them in your jeans pockets, right? So this is a problem that we have to worry about, the media problem. And the other problem with the media is that not only do the media themselves degrade, right, but the devices for reading them become obsolete. So, right, we have a 5¼ inch floppy disks. Does anyone remember those? I remember those. Yeah, okay. And zip drives, which were around in about the 90s, right? It's hard to find zip drives anymore to read those disks anymore. Lauren provided this picture of something called Frank, which is short for the Frankenstein machine. This is something that's being used at Pitt. That's right. Basically, somebody had to make a conglomeration of all of these devices for reading all of the older media that they came across in order to get the data off of those media, right? So these are the kinds of things we need to be concerned about when we're writing our data management plan. Anything else you want to say about Frank?
Its usability is dubious because all those devices don't work together, talk to each other. So it's very hard for archivists to have to use something like that.
Yeah. They're lucky that they have something like that. Most places don't even have anything.
It was hand-built by our IT staff.
Yeah, clearly. Okay.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
If you're going to talk, there's a microphone in the middle of your table.
Oh, yeah.
It's got a red light to mean the microphone's turned off. And if you do want to ask a question, I'm going to ask that you push the button that says push to turn your microphone green so that your question will be recorded. Okay, thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so that was the first problem. The second problem is related to that, but this is the format or the encoding problem. This has to do with the material that is on the media that you're saving. And this has to do with the use of proprietary formats. I mean, we kind of know this now, to not use proprietary formats and to use only open formats. But the problem is that proprietary formats are controlled by IP law, right, intellectual property law, and subject to the whims of the developers, right, their desire for money, or people simply retire, et cetera. Companies go out of business. Do you guys remember this program called HyperCard? Anyone recognize this? Yeah. So people in the early days of digital language documentation were very excited to be making dictionaries on HyperCard. And now the data is ostensibly lost because we have no way of reading HyperCard that's very easy these days. There was an example in Alaska of Gwich'in language, had a beautiful dictionary that no one can really get to anymore. Okay. Yeah, okay. And then finally, there's the storage and access problem, which is a big deal, especially to me and Susan. We think about this one a lot. So the problem with individual linguists, right, is that individuals cannot effectively store data, right? We think we can, but we actually can't, okay? The reason is because we simply don't have the technological know-how or even the hardware and the software to do it ourselves, right? It's not enough to keep your data on your computer. It's not enough to keep your data on your laptop and another computer, right? That's just simply not enough. We also don't have the professional expertise to keep up with the latest technologies for migrating data, et cetera, right? We're linguists, we're concerned with linguistics, we're not necessarily concerned with the details behind data preservation. The other thing that happens is that we don't do this forever, right? We lose interest, we retire, we get hit by a bus, right? All of these things that can happen. And so it's just not a good idea to think that your data is going to be safe under your own control in the short term or the long term, right? Any of these things could happen. So we want to stress that it's only an archive that can effectively protect your data for the long term, okay? And how do we define an archive? Well, this is a definition that I like. An archive has an institutional commitment to backing up and migrating your data in the long term, right? So these are places like university libraries, right? University libraries usually have data policies that state that it's part of our responsibility in the long term to, in perpetuity, back up data, migrate data, and take care of the data, right? There's other definitions of archives, too, that we'll talk about, I think, tomorrow, so that you can select an archive that you'll work with. But really, it's that institutional commitment that's important, because it's bigger than one person, it's bigger than one, even like a linguistics department or something. Your linguistics department server is probably also not enough, right? You need to go to the university level or beyond that to properly think about where to store your data. The other thing that has to do with storage and access is that once data is stored, it also has to be what's called discoverable. All right? It means people need to know that it exists. And that's why we're going to talk about metadata, which most of you probably know that term by now. But if you don't know the term metadata, it's data about your data. This is essentially catalog information that describes your data, right? It says who collected it, when was it collected, what is it, what language is it, et cetera. All of the information that you would have looked up in an old-fashioned card catalog, you need to have that information available, and it needs to be made, this metadata needs to be made publicly available in some way, and we'll talk about ways to do that as well. So your data is kind of useless if no one can find it, okay? The other thing that we talk about is also accessibility, right? And we'll talk about how to decide what is the proper way to make your data accessible. There are a lot of ethical considerations when it comes to making data accessible, okay? As Susan said, you don't have to make everything accessible, but it is important to make as much as possible accessible, right? So data that's not discoverable and data that's not accessible is essentially useless, okay? All right, and so a data management plan addresses these problems. This is a cute little video you can watch in your own time. I'm not going to play it now. But basically, a good data management plan helps you because it gives you the opportunity to think through and to write down what you're going to do in the long term. It also helps your funder because it allows them to feel good about giving you money, okay? And it also helps your research because this is actually a big issue, I think, in linguistic research, is that it helps your research, and it also helps linguistic research with a capital L, right? Because if linguistics is a science that is based on data, then we are a better science, right? And linguistic claims need to be verifiable in some way, and we only can do that by making our data available to look at by other people. Okay, so that's basically why we need data management plans. Are there any questions at this point? No? Okay, so we have plenty of time. We have half an hour for our first working session, which I'm going to let Lauren explain to you, our speed data-ing session.
Yes. As a librarian, I'm obliged to make puns. it's part of my code of conduct. So speed dataing is an activity that comes out of an initiative called Love Your Data Week, which happens around Valentine's Day every year. So watch out for it around Valentine's Day. And Love Your Data Week is a week of events designed to help you take care of your data, talk about your data. So speed dataing is an activity that we did at my library, which was great fun for our graduate students who attended, and I'd like to reproduce that here as a way to break the ice, get to know each other a little bit, and start to be able to talk about the data that we're working with. So as I count, we have 18 students and 2 interpreters, so I'm only going to count the 18 students. And what I would like to do is give you, let's see, what time is it? It's 9:30. 9:30, okay, so you have about 10 minutes to write about your data set. And in the work session file, there is 3 questions to guide you. It's these 3 questions that are on the board here. And then we would like you to be able to explain your data, your hypothetical data or your actual data set that you're going to write your DMP about in 1 minute. So this is like the elevator speech, right? Be able to say the basics, introduce your data set, and introduce yourself. Like say, my name is Lauren, and my data set are chat logs from World of Warcraft that I'm archiving and using to study LGBT gamers in 1 minute. That wasn't 1 minute, but you know what I mean. And then we're going to, at 9:45, exactly, I think, we will split you up. So we'll have 9 people. So let's say this half of the room, I think 2, 4, 6, 8, plus 1 person. Bring your chairs over here and make a line of 9. And then there will be 9 people sitting, and then 9 people who will rotate. And we'll have 1 minute. You'll introduce yourself, introduce your data set in 1 minute, and then you'll move. Okay? Does that make sense? It'll get you up and moving a little bit. It'll be good. Actually, why don't we make it at 9:40, so we'll have plenty of time. Okay. That's a great idea. Let's do it standing instead of bringing chairs over to give a little more time. Okay, so we'll explain this again at 9:40. So you'll have 7 minutes to just write up a basic 1 minute introduction to your data set, and then we'll go around and introduce each other in this speed dating format, okay?
Lauren, let me just add also, if you don't yet know what your data set looks like, it's okay to just talk about your research project. We'll work through that, what your data set looks like.
Yeah, so this is kind of like an icebreaker, all right? Sound good? Do it to it. You can talk to each other too. It doesn't have to be quiet. So you have a couple of new folks joining us, so you're going to be thrown right into the fray here. We now have 2 rows of 10. So if you wouldn't mind, folks on this side of the room, if you would line up right here, and folks on this side of the room line up right here for me. We're going to have an icebreaker, speed dataing icebreaker. What we're going to do is I'm going to time you, so each person has 1 minute to introduce yourself and describe what kind of data you're working with or your project. And I will announce when 1 minute is up, and then you'll switch, so then your other partner will have a minute to introduce themselves and talk about their data. And then I'll announce switch partners. And then this group closest to me on this side here, you'll just walk that way 1. Person at the end, sorry, you're going to have to come all the way to the other side. You'll just go 1 person that way, all right? Does this make sense? Oh, we have some interpreters, so you're going to have have an interesting situation. Okay. Okay. Yes, 1 minute, 1 minute, switch. So why don't we say the first minute are the people on the left, on this side. And then the second minute will be the other side, and then the people who went the second minute will be the ones moving. Okay? Does this make sense? I know it's crazy. All right, I'm going to start the timer. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Speed dataing. There's like not enough space. 3, 2, 1. Second partner. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Switch partners. Move down towards the exit of the room. I know, you guys, only one side can move. Switch partners. Come on down, last person in the row.
Hi, my name's Atticus.
They're already starting. Okay, 1 minute now. Three, two, one. Second person, go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Switch partners. Move down. Move down.
Hi, I'm still Atticus.
We need to make a little room. Move down. Move down. Come on down.
I'm doing a dictionary elicitation project right now, so we have at the very least. I'm after this goes.
3, 2, 1. Swap. Second person, go. Ten seconds. 3, 2, 1. Switch partners. Move on down. Move on down. I know this is. All right. All right, folks. Welcome back from your lunch. Hope you're excited to talk about ethics and copyright. Yeah, I am. This is like literally what I do all day long, so I love this stuff. This is gonna go right into my pocket, boom. All right, so I'm Lauren. I'm your local copyright expert here. I am not a lawyer, so please be advised that nothing I say here can actually be taken as legal advice. I have to say that for like everything I say. It should just be my email signature, I think, at this point. We're going to talk about ethics and legal compliance, and it's actually, so if we think about the cycle of a research project, if you look at our little diagram here from top where you design something to going around clockwise to the end where you're tracking the impact of your project after it's completed, this idea of ethics and legal compliance should come in right near the beginning during the plan and collection phase. If you wait till the end, you might have an unfortunate situation. So why does this matter? That's the question. Ethics is usually something most people can understand. Most people have to take a course on research ethics for, say, your institutional review board, your IRB training. Most people have to go, anybody, we've all gone through this kind of course? Okay. So right now, we're kind of embedded in this culture of data sharing and ethics. Pretty much anytime we hear anything coming out of our White House, we're wondering what's going, like something about data, something about ethics. But legal compliance with our data, a lot of folks aren't really thinking about that at the beginning of their projects, at least not in my experience. Some don't know that they should be thinking about it. Some, like the dude in the XKCD cartoon here, are too lazy or too busy to think about it, or perhaps too profit motivated to think about it. And so that can cause issues later. I'm not judging your reasons at all here, because I have been there. And I'm going to tell you a short cautionary tale from my experience that may shed some light into how this can affect you later on. So back in 2007, I began a project that would turn into the data source for both my master's thesis and dissertation. It was an ethnography of online gamers, which I've mentioned before. I studied World of Warcraft LGBT players. So I did not give a second thought to how I gathered data, because it's data, right? It's out there. I'm gathering it. It's mine, right? Right? So over 5 years, I collected data. I had about 1.5 million lines of in-game chat That's well over a gig of text-based data. I also had recordings, video recordings, screen captures of in-game events, chats. I had recordings of voice chat in the game, like a whole hard drive full of this, backed up several times. I had a whole system, which we might talk about later. It was immense. And when it came time for me to be done with this project, I thought, oh boy, this would be a great resource for other people doing research on online speech. It'd be great, right? There's this huge data set, and I can anonymize it pretty easily. It's already one layer of anonymity because everybody uses a pseudonym already in online games. So there'd be another layer. It'd be super easy, right? Well, I encountered a very helpful librarian, the kind of librarian I hope to turn into one day, who was in charge of our repository where I was going to put my data and my dissertation. And he said to me a very innocent question. He said, "Who owns this data?" And I said, "Me? I think it's me." He said, "Well, I've played a few online games in my day, and I know you usually sign some kind of agreement, right?" I see the recognition in your eyes. You're all thinking all those terms of service, right? You just say, "I agree to go on," right? "I agree to whatever data Facebook wants from me. I just want to see what my friends' vacation pictures look like," or "I want to look at pictures of cats," or whatever. I had done the same thing for my data set in World of Warcraft. I tried to find the agreement I signed in 2007. It did not exist anymore. So I had to abide by the one I signed in 2012 when I collected my last bits of data. And it superseded all previous terms of service, and that said this: "And all rights and title in and to the service, including without limitation, moral rights, any related documentation, applets, transcripts of the chat rooms, character profile information, recordings of games are owned by Blizzard, the game company, and its licensors." Not me. It's owned by a international multi-billion-dollar online gaming company. You can read those terms of service right there. It's the same ones I signed in 2012. So everything, all my data, everything, all the videos of the game, because it's recordings of the games, all transcripts that I had saved, everything didn't belong to me. Everything. So I sent in a request. I asked permission. I said, "I have over a gig of chat transcripts. I have video recordings, audio recordings. I have images, screenshots I've taken of things that have happened. It comprises this amount." I set out all the things that I had. And I said, "This is for a research project. I would love other people to be able to do research on this too. May I please share these data or any portion of it?" No response. Nothing. I tried calling, sent a million emails, even contacted a person that I knew who worked for the company to see if there was a real live human that I could find. No response. Nothing. So, you know where those data are now? Sitting on a hard drive in a drawer in my house. I can't share them legally. I can't share any part of them outside of the doctrine of fair use, which I have used to share in my dissertation and my articles. I have made that argument, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But that incredible resource that I could have shared just because I said, "I accept," and clicked. So that's why I'm here today, to talk to you guys about this, because it's important and it can mess you up in the future. So how to not be like 2007 Lauren? Know your rights and responsibilities. And being in this workshop is a great start. I am so glad you all are here, and it's awesome. So this is the kind of thing we're going to talk about in this session. So we're going to talk about copyright, because that is probably the legal framework that most definitely applies to the work that you're doing. There are other things like patents that may apply to some of you that is beyond the scope of this talk today, maybe trademarks. But we're going to talk about what's the definition of copyright in your jurisdiction, because it changes internationally, and how to figure that out. Who owns the data you're using, how to figure that out. What are you legally allowed to do, even if somebody else owns your data? I mentioned fair use. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk about some ethics, because this is all tied up in ethics, because even though it is legal, does not necessarily mean it's ethical. Okay? All right. And how will all these impact your long-term plans? Because you're making a plan right now, and as you go forward into the future, they're going to be shaped by these ethical and legal considerations that you're working under. All right. What is copyright? Let's start by making sure we're all on the same page, because I teach copyright workshops all the time. And people come in and they think they know what copyright is, and they don't. So let's all be on the same page. So according to the US Copyright Office, and this is a definition that is shared by most countries under several copyright treaties, copyright protects original works of authorship that are fixed in a tangible form of expression. Okay, so what does it mean to be an original work of authorship? And it has to not only be original, it has to also be creative. So, for example, if I draw a beautiful sketch of a cat on that whiteboard, is that something that could be subject to copyright? Is it an original work? Yes, okay. Is it creative? Is it fixed in a tangible form of expression? No, why not? So what could I do if I wanted to fix it? Take a photo. Great. You guys are awesome already. What about the words that I'm speaking right now? Are these subject to copyright? If it's recorded, is it being recorded? Yes. So this is subject to copyright, that's why I had to sign that release form, right? Okay, well, why I will have to sign the release form if I haven't done it already. Okay, so some examples of things that are, well, we'll talk about not copyrightable in a second. So when you have copyright, when you own copyright to something, that is the right to do the following things. That is reproduce and distribute. To make derivative works based on that thing. So if I take my picture of my sketch of my cat and then I turn it into a poster that I'm going to put on somebody's wall, that's a derivative work. I have the right to do that, but other people would not. And then perform and display. So if my sketch of my cat is so beautiful, somebody wants to put it in an art gallery, they have to ask my permission because I have the right to perform and display that. Okay? Copyright basics, there's a great circular here if you want to know like all the little parts. This is like a 2-page circular. It's really great from the Copyright Office. You can get the link right there. Yes. Is there? Yeah, hit the button, please.
Okay, so what I was wondering is this, the fact that you've just made your drawing on the board, and taken a picture of it, that in itself doesn't copyright it, right?
It does.
It does.
As soon as you fix it in the tangible form, you own the copyright. You don't need to sign, register, no. US copyright law, that is true. It wasn't always that way. This changed several years ago. So there are some things, some older things from like the 60s and 50s that if they didn't register it, then it may not still be under copyright. This is really complicated. But that's not the case anymore. All right. Now that we know what copyright is, what is not subject to copyright? Work that is not fixed in a tangible form. We've already talked about the whiteboard. We've talked about the non-recorded speech. You also can't fix, you also cannot own copyright to titles, names, short phrases, slogans, and familiar symbols. So, you know, you can't copyright the words "and also," because then, like, we'd owe a lot of money to somebody, and that would be weird. You also can't copyright ideas, and that includes methods, processes, discoveries, and other things that are process and methodical. That's distinguished from expressions of these. So if you draw a beautiful diagram of your method for your data collection and it's got colors and symbols and processes, that is copyrightable, but not the method itself. Otherwise, we couldn't replicate any studies ever. Right? You also can't copyright common property. For example, what I always say when I give this talk to a bunch of scientists is measurements of the state of the world. So I can't copyright it that I measured that it rained 1.5 inches yesterday, for example. That's a state of the world. That is data. That is a number. That is something that is common knowledge to anybody who had a measuring stick out. So most quantitative data falls into this bucket. Okay, you can't copyright facts. And the fact that it rained 1.5 inches yesterday is a fact. So you can't copyright that. But
Copyright alternative facts? That's the creative aspect, right?
if they're in, if you can copyright alternative, I don't want to. I remember I'm not a lawyer.
Great question. I don't have any. I guess that's creative. Yes, so also for linguistics purposes, common property can also cover some aspects of traditional knowledge. We're going to get to that in a couple of slides here. It's very interesting, something that I just learned about recently. Okay. So when we want to reuse something that is copyright by somebody else, I mentioned the fair use doctrine. And you'll see I have a picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the slide here, is because she's my hero, and also because she does a lot of work with fair use. So fair use is a doctrine of copyright law. It allows for the reuse of copyright works in ways that are considered fair. What does fair mean? Like, I would think that me sharing all my data that I collected from World of Warcraft is fair, but that doesn't count. What the law says is there are certain reasons, and there's 4 factors of fair use. So the reasons that are considered fair are things like criticism, research, teaching, scholarship, news reporting, commentary, parody. I think it's how South Park is allowed to exist. And then there are 4 factors that you can analyze to see if your work or your reuse of something is fair. So if you want to reuse my cat drawing in something, you could think, okay, well, what's the purpose and character of my reuse? So if you're saying, wow, this sketch demonstrates this great technique of drawing and I'm going to use it in my class to show an example, that could be an educational purpose, educational use. And if you're teaching a nonprofit institution, that would also be under this first factor of fair use. Second factor is the nature of the copyrighted work, that work that you want to reuse. For example, whether it's factual or creative in nature. So the sketch is very creative, that would disfavor fair use. But if it's a factual document, like say a dictionary or a lexicon, that's factual, it would favor fair use. There's the amount or the substantiality. So if you only use a little bit, or just as much as you need, just a tiny bit, 1 page of that dictionary to show some words that you want to illustrate, for example. If you just show like a very small version of my drawing of my cat that can't be replicated, then that tends toward fair use. If you use the whole thing, use that whole book, use the whole article, the entire picture, it can favor against. And finally, the effect of the use upon the market. So if your use would substitute for a potential sale, so if you're going to take my cat drawing and put it on a poster and sell it, favors against fair use. But nobody in your class on drawing would probably buy my cat poster, so that would favor. So this is fair use. I have a lot more. I made a guide on this. It's linked here. Excuse me. Fair use allows a lot of academic work to happen, including data work, and it's very important for some data uses to understand fair use. All right, next. International copyright. Copyright law can vary from place to place. So if you're doing field work in another country, I would suggest that you check with a copyright specialist before you go, just to make sure you don't run afoul of local laws. There's a great search engine from the World Intellectual Property Organization. It's linked here. There are librarians who are specialized in this, like me. So you should look for somebody like a scholarly communications librarian or a copyright librarian or anybody with a title, something like this. General counsel at your university is also a resource. They don't want you to run into trouble any more than you do. They want you to stay out of trouble so they can point you in the right direction or give you some advice. And they actually are lawyers, so that could actually be legal advice. Okay. And as we learned earlier in my cautionary tale, contracts are important to think about too. So copyright law is the default, but it is overridden by contracts. So if you sign an agreement or agree to terms of service that's different from general copyright law, then you have agreed to something else. So you should know what's in that contract. So these can include work for hire, in which the material that you create belongs to your employer. Some universities have these. Mine does not, but yours might. You might want to check. Grant requirements. There may be some grant agencies that require you to do something with your products of your research. And terms of service, of course.
So know in advance what the contracts are that you are working under and where to find them, and know what it is. And also, if you hire somebody, like a translator, a transcriber, or somebody to work with you, spell out clearly when you hire them who owns the copyright of the work that they create. Spell that out clearly so that everybody's on the same page at the very beginning. You could say, all your translations, I will attribute you for your work, but I will take ownership of them under this contract that we sign. I'll give you credit though. Put it on your CV. All right. Let's talk about some specific linguistics stuff. Here are some examples of things. And I got a lot of this information from an article by Newman. It's in the helpful articles folder. I really recommend reading it. It's a little bit snarky. If you read copyright material in a snarky voice in your head, it really helps to understand it better. That's my secret. So, for example, spoken and written language is usually considered an original work of authorship. That's why we have release forms, so that we have people say, okay, I'm giving you my words so that you can use them for your research. A lexicon, as a word list, is a list of the contents of a language, not necessarily subject to copyright, though, because it's a fact about the world, right? Although your organization, your layout, your description that may accompany that word list, your beautifully worded definitions, those may be subject to copyright. Vowel measurements, because they are a quantitative fact about the world, are not generally subject to copyright, but your awesome plot of them is. An interesting case that came up at my university is about text mining. Does anybody do text mining yeah, a couple people do text mining? Okay. They may be subject to copyright. Books, online newspapers, online language, especially online language. We were just talking about Facebook earlier. Careful of that social media stuff. I would say always, if you're doing text mining, check out your terms of service. Some allow for these corpora to be used for research or academic educational purposes, which would be your purpose, but some do not. You may need special permission. There was a case of this with a bunch of online journal articles. Somebody was trying to text mine them, and the publisher got really upset about that. All right. Okay, and finally, we mentioned traditional knowledge earlier. These are, for example, folk tales. This is a special case. There's actually a whole document on this. So this is the one that I found. There's a whole bunch of documents. The one that I found the most clear and helpful was the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity from 2001. And it was the most clear. There's a bunch of other information about this. They say that traditional knowledge, which includes language, stories, and history, is a public good, and therefore should not be subject to intellectual property rights. That is, if I get somebody to sign away copyright to me over their story from their culture, I should not be able to own the copyright to that. That just seems weird, right? It's like, it's a tangled question, because in these cases, the individual performer of a story, a language, or song should be acknowledged, credited, and their rights protected. So in these cases, UNESCO and many of these other documents always suggest, be clear as you can, about your intended use of the works of the people that you're interviewing or you're working with. Get their permission for your use. And if there's going to be any kind of profit made off of this at all, that profit should be directed back to the community that the work came from. This is a very simplistic view of this. This can be a very tough ethical situation. So it's important to think very clearly about it. I know a lot of folks, their first instinct is, I'm a researcher, I'm doing this for good, I'm not going to hurt anybody, it'll be okay. But sometimes there can be unintended consequences. And this is a new topic for me. I learned a lot about this from Susan and her work. So further questions, and yes, further question.
What counts as profit?
Yeah.
So like, do you have to actually be selling whatever it is that you have, or is it like, I included this data in my grant application and won a grant?
Yeah, that's a great question. Traditionally, what I work with is actual profit, like monetary profits. But Susan, do you have a
thought on that?
My interpretation is that it needs to be like you, once you have published a book, then you are listed as the author in the Library of Congress, and any kind of royalties that come off of that book go to you, and you should then redirect those royalties to the community.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, not a grant. I mean, the grant's not a profit, right? That was like money that you have been given to do a job.
Yeah, that's
It's
what I was wondering,
not-
was whether that counted as a profit, because you're still receiving money.
Right. No, we're thinking more of royalties. So if you were an ethnomusicologist and recorded a lot of songs and put out, you know, I was about to say a record album. Those don't exist anymore, but you know what I mean. Like if you put it on whatever place you sell your music. If you're an ethnomusicologist, any profit that you get should be redirected back to the community.
But I think the grant question is a good ethical one. So if I've been given this grant to collect a word list from this language, what can I do to benefit the community as much as they have benefited me? So if I can make, this word list publicly available so that they can then do cool things with it, or a lot of people will make books out of it and share it with the community. Various projects like this giving back part of our work is tied up in these questions. Very great question. Other questions by the monitor? Okay. There's also the LSA ethics statement. I've added some the emphasis has been added to this slide about relevant parts. This statement should guide your thoughts on this. You can read the whole thing. And one thing I would like to add to this is that I mentioned earlier, just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean you should do it. So there's a great case of this. Did anybody hear about there's a scholar named Emil Kierkegaard? Anybody hear about the OkCupid guy?
Yeah.
You've heard about the OkCupid guy. How many people have heard about this case? Okay, I'm going to tell you all about the OkCupid guy. So OkCupid is an online dating site. It's more than that, but basically an online dating site. This guy, Emil Kierkegaard at a university in Denmark, I believe, discovered that profile information on OkCupid, you could see it publicly and you could scrape the data from the website. And it wasn't like public, like you just go, like any random person could go there and see it, but it was behind an API. So he scraped all this data from an online dating site, including names, ages, sexual preferences, etc., and put it in a spreadsheet and just put it on the internet, not anonymized at all. All that information just out there. And his defense was that, well, it was public and this is information that'd be really great for doing research. Doesn't mean you should do that. And in fact, what did he say? So the only reason that he didn't also include the photos of people in the spreadsheet is that it would take up too much storage space. So this kind of use was not prohibited by terms of service, and it's legal because it's technically public information, but that doesn't mean you should put it in a spreadsheet and put it out there on the internet for anybody to see. So this is a great example of when something is legal but not ethical. So very good to think about that. Yes?
To be fair, though, OkCupid does do that.
Yes,
So,
they do.
although they somewhat anonymize that.
Yes, that is fair. Also legal, but not ethical. There's in the notes for this slide, there's a link to the article about this particular case if you want to read more about it. Okay, so let's talk about ethics and sharing data. So once you know who owns your data, you can now understand and plan for what you do with the data, how to do that ethically and legally. So as we mentioned earlier, data that isn't accessible by anybody is useless, kind of like my data. So here's some advice I have on the slide for you in general about when you think about sharing data and ethics. So first, you should gain consent, informed consent from your participants at the outset for both the preservation and the sharing of data. This is a part that is sometimes missing from consent forms. I don't know how often that might come through in some of these projects that have been worked on at the archives here, but I've certainly seen it when I work with students that they don't have anything about preservation and sharing. And then you need to think, do I need to anonymize the data in order to share it? What is my process for doing that? How am I going to make sure that I do that in a way that is not like this guy in the OkCupid stuff, but actually preserves anonymity. And if you are collecting any sensitive data, you may have additional things to think about, not just anonymization, but also security of storage and transfer of the data. And this is something where repository and archive staff can help you with this. But where are you storing that original data set that has all the names that are de-anonymized? Like, do you still have that? Where is it? And what am I doing with it? How am I making sure it's safe? And then will you be able to make your data set open? And there's actually a decision tree about this, which I can show you. Maybe. There we go. Let's see this decision tree. So this is from Force 11, which is a data well, it's a future research and communication and e-scholarship, so it's all kinds of different things. Boy, you cannot read that on the screen at all. Well, I'm going to let you guys look at this on your own, because this is an actual decision tree where you can go through such questions. I can't even read it on the screen. There we go. It's sort of easy to read there. So, you know, are the data digital? Can it be digitized? Is it in a proprietary format? Can it be converted into an open format? Is it sensitive data? Has a description of the data been out there? Were permissions obtained? So there's this decision tree that can help guide you through this question of whether your whole data set can be made open and some of the considerations there. It's a nice decision tree. Back to here. Okay. Make it big. And I've talked with some of you about the idea of not sharing perhaps your whole data set, but parts of it, excerpts of it, or data for a certain question or a certain paper that you've written or a certain part of your project. So that may be less sensitive, but still helpful to the community. So we were talking about somebody has an interview and maybe just sharing the charts of the vowel plots and the formants and such from the interview rather than the whole transcript itself, for example. That might be a helpful thing to share openly, even if you can't share your whole data set. Okay. We have a lot of resources about this that I've collected on this slide. There's a lot about intellectual property rights and cultural heritage. Susan has an entire bibliography on consent, copyright, IP, and traditional knowledge. It's amazing. There's that article about copyright for linguists that's super snarky that I mentioned earlier. And also there's a lot of copyright crash courses out there by university libraries. University libraries are really a great place to go for copyright questions. So please don't be afraid to find your local friendly librarian who's a lot less scary than your general counsel person. Not that I've had any experience with that. So I've given you like just a really broad overview because these issues are going to apply differently to lots of different projects. So I have for a working session for you, first of all, the question, are your data subject to copyright? Are parts of it subject to copyright or not? This is a big question that you can think about now using this knowledge that I've just passed on to you and that you can further explore. And then depending on your data situation, there's three additional questions for you to think about. Are you working under contracts? Where can you find them? This would be a great place to collect links or download the contracts that you have signed, if you've signed any of those. Are you doing field work in another country? You can search for the copyright law in that country using the search engine here. And finally, are there ethical considerations, especially for those of you maybe working with some sensitive data or privacy concerns in your data? This would be a great time to brainstorm and talk through some ethical considerations with other humans who understand and kind of try to start exploring the issues. So please do feel free to work together on this. Let's see. Yeah, that's the last slide. And this is all in the Google Drive document as well. So I will be around. I will talk to you all. My colleagues are around. And we can talk to each other, start talking through some of these issues because it's big and complex. But that's the overview and introduction to copyright and ethics. We have about 25 minutes to actually work on this and talk to each other. So that's awesome. Please, if you have a question specifically for me, just like grab me. So, well, don't actually grab me, but like, that'd be weird. Tell me about it. Okay.
Okay. All right, we're ready to get started with the next session. All right, so to give you an idea of what's coming up for the rest of the workshop, we've got a couple more sessions like this where we're going to have some information and then some work sessions and some information and some work sessions. And then tomorrow, we're going to spend the afternoon, like we said earlier, we're going to spend the afternoon fleshing out this document, okay? But at this point, you haven't actually seen a data management plan, so you don't know what this mysterious document looks like. We're going to have a couple examples to show you tomorrow and to show you what you're aiming for, so that it doesn't seem like this mysterious target. Yeah.
I'm working on one right now.
Okay. She's making one. Are you making one?
Well, I got permission from a friend of mine who had a very good data management plan to anonymize her data management plan and share it with you all. And so I'm currently anonymizing that data management plan.
Okay, yeah.
And we'll share it. And I was also thinking that I would listen in on some of the data types that you guys are working with, and then
Invent one.
like invent a data management plan, right?
Are you doing that?
Not yet.
No, okay, but you will, okay. Okay. All right, so, and obviously the 7 sessions that we're presenting you with translate into 7 sections of the document, right? Okay. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about now is storage and backup. All right, so you have to have a plan for storage and backup. And what we're talking about in this section is the short-term storage and backup, right? So we're talking about how are you going to protect your data while it's still kind of in your possession, and I'm calling it this, in the field and the lab, meaning while it's still, while you're still doing the analysis, while you're still doing the processing. This is separate from your plan later, right, which is to archive things, although I should say that I'm putting a temporal difference on storage and backup on the one hand and archiving on the other, but it's actually not the case that you should ever wait until your project is, quote, over to archive. You should actually archive immediately, right, as soon as you collect data. But I'm talking about how do you care for the data while it's still in your possession, right? It's a different idea than how to care for data when it's in the archive. Yes?
I also wanted to mention that I think someone said earlier that, or I heard someone say that you don't, like NSF checks up, or funders check up on certain things, but I just wanted to mention that in my case, with my IRB, our IRB people came around a couple years ago just to check
Just to
make
see.
sure
Yes.
that I had it all organized and it was all safe and so on. It was quite a scary experience.
So be warned. Wow. Yeah. It's like getting audited by the IRS. That's scary. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
What university?
Yeah.
University of Alabama.
Okay. Wow. All right. They must have a lot of extra staff. That's great. Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is about caring for your data while it's in your possession. And we talk about 2 things here. We talk about protection for integrity, data integrity, right? And then also protection for security and access. So I'll talk about both of those. In reality, the plans for doing this kind of protection of your storage of your data will overlap in a lot of ways with your plans for protecting your data in the long term in an archive. But that's fine. Okay. Okay, so talking about storage and backup for data integrity. Okay, so your data is very vulnerable while you're collecting it and while you're processing it. In some ways, it feels like it might be more vulnerable if you're doing field work, but it's also equally vulnerable if you're staying right on campus in your laboratory to do work, right? There's a lot of electronic or digital dangers that your data can become victim of. So your hard drives can break and you can have power surges and viruses, et cetera. Environmental dangers are also possible. Water damage. Fire damage. So when I was working in Alaska in the summer, there's a high chance of forest fire in Alaska, and so you have to make sure that you've got a way to protect your data in case your cabin burns down, right? Insects can be a problem. Mold can be a problem. Yes?
Our IT person told me about a guy in the sciences at our university who had his entire data set on an external drive and ransomware got it.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yes. And ransomware got into it. Yes. Okay. I should put. Yeah, that's I guess under viruses, but I should put. Ransomware, et cetera, under there. And then there's also your human dangers, right? You could spill your cup of coffee on your drive. It could get stolen. It could get lost. You could accidentally write over your data. You could back over it with your Jeep, I guess. I don't know, right? There's things that can happen to your data. So you have to be careful. All right. So the way we handle this is a principle called locks. Have you heard of this idea before? Locks? Raise your hand if you have. Yes, over there. Lauren has, okay. It stands for lots of copies, keep stuff safe, all right? It's a terrible acronym, but it's actually quite handy because it's true. If you have lots of copies of your data, it will keep your data safe, okay? So how do we implement locks? And by the way, it's a good idea to use this acronym in your data management plan, right? Say, I'm going to follow the principle of locks, and then describe how you're going to do that, okay? All right, so there's a couple things that you should say in your data management plan depending on the kind of work that you're doing, right? So if you're doing field work, all right, you should describe very carefully how you're going to keep lots of copies of things, right? How will you redundantly back up your data, okay? Are you going to have multiple hard drives? Are you going to have multiple flashcards? Where are they going to be stored? What is your procedure for doing the backup going to be, okay? So when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork, is that the next slide? Yeah, when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork, I had 3 hard drives, and every day after and I did my work in this little cabin, and every day after my sessions were over, I would redundantly copy everything onto 3 different hard drives, okay? And then I would leave one in my cabin, I would put one in my car, and then I would take one over to the Atna Cultural Center and leave it there as well. And it seemed a little nutty, and I was constantly driving all over taking things, but that was my procedure, and you have to describe that kind of thing. Be specific about how you're going to back it up. It's one thing to say that you're going to redundantly copy files from one drive to another. That's good, but it's much better to say I'm going to do it on a daily basis after every session, just to show the funders that you've thought through your plan of how you're going to do this. Okay?
Can I add something?
Yeah?
The other thing, the reason this is so important to think about is that when you're doing field work, you don't realize how many hours a day you actually need to spend managing your data. And so going through this exercise will help you understand that this is not something that you can save 5 minutes for at the end of every work day. You really need to dedicate your time. In fact, I think at one point all of my spare non-working time was spent backing up my data.
Yeah. And keeping track of your metadata and all of those little files, all of the data. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's true. Leave a lot of time. I realize that some of you are going to be doing fieldwork in places where electricity is an issue, right? There are other ways to handle this, right? So for example, you could work with small SD cards, right? There's a way to copy things onto SD cards redundantly, and you can keep very good metadata in a notebook with the understanding that next time you go to town or as soon as you get home, your very first task will be to sit down and take care of all of that. Put everything on hard drives, keyboard all of your metadata immediately. It should be the first thing that you do, okay? And we'll talk about later how you need to remember that metadata is not something you can keep in your head. You will forget it, so you need to immediately document your metadata, okay? Okay, so that was field work. Okay, and we can talk during the work session about more details of that. If you're doing work in the lab, you need to think about how are you going to redundantly back up your data and protect your data while you're in the lab. A great idea is to use the IT services at your university. Okay, and this is usually going to be something that is beyond the level of your department. Probably most of you have a server in your department that your departmental website is housed on. That's probably not enough. Okay, that doesn't necessarily have a backup procedure for data. But if you go to something that's more centrally located at your university, like the IT department or possibly even the library could help you, you can talk to them about what kind of plan they have for redundant backup. So for example, IT departments will often have a daily backup procedure where they'll back up all of the data they house to an off-site location automatically. Yes?
So I found this out as I was working with the librarian to write one of these recently, that I was saying, well, I'm going to be using this RedCap database for the university. I'm going to be using U-Box to, to back things up. And she said, find online, all that stuff is there. They have their little paragraphs describing what their, where their servers are located and all of that stuff. And so, you can just lift that language out of their descriptions, which was very helpful for me because I knew it was secure because it was approved by the university for research. I knew it was FERPA and
FERPA, exactly.
and HIPAA secure. So obviously it had all that stuff. So I used those terms, that it was FERPA and HIPAA secure, but they had a lot of other details too. What was tricky was figuring out how much of that detail needed to be in the 2-page document, and I don't know if I drew that line in the right place.
Yeah,
But
okay.
that was really helpful
Yes.
to know you know, that stuff was available and you can just take that language.
Yes, exactly. And if it's multiple paragraphs, you can often just summarize it in a couple of sentences and provide the link.
This looks important, this looks
Yes.
important.
Yeah, and put the link so that people could, your reviewers can confirm it. Yeah, and that's fine. Yeah, that's very good. Okay. Okay, what else is here? Oh, and then Susan wanted me to add something about called the 3-2-1 principle, which is an approach to locks, right? Where you make a plan to have at least 3 copies of your data at all times, right? On 2 different types of storage media with at least one of those off-site. All right, I like to up it a little bit and say maybe 3 different types of storage media with 2 of them off-site. And by different types of storage media, we even mean different brands of hard drive, right? So you can go to Costco and buy a 3-pack of hard drives for $100, but maybe that's not what you want to do because they're all going to potentially have the same defect. Yeah, exactly. So buy different brands of hard drive, or do a hard drive and some flash storage, or a hard drive and DVDs even, something like that. So think of multiple ways that you can anticipate problems and then head them off. Yes?
I'm noticing, like, for example, I've got this My Passport Ultra here,
Mm-hmm.
external drive, and I keep intending to investigate this, but I haven't. Some of these things seem to have something that says automatic backup,
Mm-hmm.
automatic backup. Do you know anything about that? Is that something we can use in this kind of a context?
You can. I think you're talking about things like an equivalent on Mac. I think it's called Time Machine. Yeah, Time Machine. Yeah, it's basically backup for people who don't want to think about backup. And those are probably fine. I personally like to know a little bit more about what's going on there, what exactly is getting backed up. Sometimes those automatic services don't make a complete copy of your entire data and replace it. Sometimes they'll just replace what's been changed since the last time. And I would prefer to have a new copy of everything made, but I don't know if that's necessarily best practice. Lauren, do you know? Yeah, the more often you rewrite data, the more chance there is for an error. So I just like to have more control over what it, but yes, I would rather you did that than did nothing. Yeah,
And I would
definitely.
say that the thing that comes on your hard drive, you need to spend a little time figuring out how to use it.
Yeah.
There will be a way to set it up so that it searches whatever folders on your hard drive you tell it to, and then it copies anything that got changed
Yeah.
or created. That it compares it to the folder on its drive. And so yes, that's a good way to do it. I always found that if you don't have a large memory on your computer to begin with, it can, I call it the spinning beach ball of death or
Mhm.
whatever on the computer, and so it can slow things down. Whereas if you know in your head what you worked on that day, it's going to be easier for you to copy 5 files over than it
Yeah.
is for that little software script to run
Yeah,
and look at everything.
that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, good, okay.
But if you're handling large quantities of data on a daily basis, then it's better to have automatic backup than it is to rely on your memory of what you changed or created that day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very good. Okay. Yes, Atticus.
Sorry, the only
Yeah.
thing is with Time Machine,
Uh-huh.
it encodes stuff in a Time Machine backup, which means it's a pain in the ass if you're using a Windows machine to get the stuff.
That's right. Yeah, that's a
So
problem as well.
In particular,
Yeah.
if you're using
Yeah.
Time Machine. I don't
Yeah.
know how Western Digitals does it. but-
Yeah. Yeah, so environment specific, yeah, is going to be difficult. Yeah, okay. Good, okay. All right, so people always want to know about cloud storage, okay? Cloud storage, things like Google Drive, which we're using for this class, it's awesome for this class. We can easily share data, but let's face it, this is not precious data that we're giving you today, right? Cloud storage should be used for collaboration only. It should never be used for your primary backup ever. Just don't do it, right? In fact, I wouldn't even mention it in a DMP. If I am planning to share my data with Susan over Dropbox, I would not put that in a DMP lest the funder think that I think that that is proper backup. It's not proper backup. It's good for sharing, and that's it. You have considerations considerations to consider, right? You have things to consider when you're thinking about cloud storage, like who owns that data, right? It's not always clear. I think Google might actually claim that they own all the data in the Google Drive, right? Or you're nodding. I think that that's what it says, right? Whether they'll ever act on that, I don't know, but there's a question of data ownership. There could be a question of cost or closing it, right, I'm going to get to that, yeah. There could be a question of cost also. You need to think about the question of cost, security, and then also going out of business. So I was looking up preparing this slide, I found an article from 2 years ago talking about the best services for cloud storage, and the number 2 site was, the first one was Spider Oak, and the second one was something called Wuala, which when you click on the link has gone out of business as of 2 years ago, right? So that can happen. So I would be very cautious with using with cloud storage and only use it for collaboration. Yes?
Yeah. What about, does it change anything if the cloud storage is like run by your university?
It depends on what their policies are, right? If you're comfortable with their backup, it's probably fine, and it's not necessarily that different than using than walking your hard drive over to the IT department and giving it to them. That's probably okay, but I would make sure that they're very specific about what their backup plans, what their own backup plans are. Yes.
So talk to your IT
Yes.
department
Yeah.
for sure, because there's a difference between like long-term preservation of files that you're storing and nightly snapshots
Right.
of the files that you were storing.
Mhm.
So they might be taking nightly snapshots, weekly snapshots, and monthly
Mhm.
snapshots, and then those cycle out, right? So a month later, the snapshot from 1 month ago is
It's gone. Yeah.
And so if you need to revert back to a version from 2 months ago, you're out of luck.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And once again, this is still not your long-term archiving plan, right?
Right.
Which may be something at university, but that's still not that. Okay. Okay. All right. Good. Okay, so other questions you need to think about when you're writing your DMP was, is it going to cost any money, right? Do you need to include a budget item for backups, for storage and backup? And that's okay, usually. Just describe what you need it for, right? So for purchasing hardware, paying storage fees, et cetera. You should also say who is responsible for regular backup. If you're working on a team, you need to state specifically who's going to be in charge of that, okay? If you're taking your data from the field and then transferring it into some sort of on-campus storage, you need to describe what the protocol for doing that will be. Okay, how are you going to do that? Do you just hand the hard drive over to your IT guy? What are you going to do? Okay, and then also, how will your data be recovered in the event of an incident? And that question is very open-ended. What counts as an incident? Right. Hopefully, your locks procedure will answer that question. Right. Well, I will have 2 other copies of that in the event of an incident. Okay. All right. So that was all about data integrity, keeping your data safe. There's also some things to think about for data security, although for the most part, linguistics, academic linguistics, doesn't have that much to worry about in terms of high-level security. Usually confidentiality is going to be your biggest risk, and we talked about that a little bit in the last session. You should be guided by your IRB and your ethics and your informed consent procedure as to whether anonymity and confidentiality, what degree you need to do that too. You should have plans to anonymize your participants if you need to. Again, you will have already worked out that plan in your IRB, how you're going to anonymize people if that's something you need to do. And plans to secure your anonymization key. So, I mean, that could even be something as I will hand write my anonymization key on a piece of paper and lock it in a file cabinet in my office under like a lock and key, and that's sometimes is fine, right? Let's see. If necessary, how will you control access to data, right? So if you have collaborators, how are you going to make sure that the right people have access to your data versus the wrong people, and you can password protect it. Obviously, don't forget to share your password with your team members, right? Some of you may be dealing with more sensitive data. I don't know if anyone's dealing with large government defense corpora, those kinds of things, right? But if you're in that business, you will already know all of this next stuff about like ISO 27001, which are higher level procedures for keeping data extremely secure. Like these are like government secrets. And so I'm not going to say much about that here because I don't know much about it. And it's like if you need it, you'll already know it, okay? Or you'll have people you can turn to, okay? Okay, so that's basically all I have to say about storage and backup. Are there any questions right now? Yeah.
I can't remember what the name of this thing is right now. There's a new trend where companies will store your stuff for free but charge you access fees.
Oh, I don't know about that. Yeah.
Okay, I was just going to ask,
Yes.
what is the general policy on that?
That sounds suspicious to me.
Yes, that sounds suspicious.
What the storing data for free, is it like cloud storage?
Yeah.
And then who, like you have to pay to access your own data, or
Yeah.
other people pay when they want to access
No,
your
no,
data?
you pay to access your own data, but
Okay.
it's unlimited free storage.
Could you say that question again?
Yeah.
Because this is something that I might have. I'm
There's-
sorry,
Yeah.
I was anonymizing something.
I've heard murmurs of companies that will store your data for free, unlimited data, but you pay to access the data or
Yes.
retrieve it.
Right.
What is the general?
Well,
belief
essentially,
backing this?
Amazon Web Services is this,
Okay.
but except that they're not storing it for free. There might be some sort of like entry user level where they might be storing it for free and you pay to access it. But yes, when you're talking about cloud storage, it's very cheap if you are storing the data and never touching it. And once you start retrieving data and moving data back and forth, that's when it starts to get expensive. And so many companies have a sliding price scale. So the more you access the data, the more expensive it is to store it, and the less you access the data, the less expensive it is to store it. That's very common for paid cloud storage now. I've never heard of the situation where it's completely
free, yeah.
free and then you.
It's possible I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Well, no, but
It's
no,
possible it's real.
It's possible
It's-
it's
yeah.
real. I totally believe it actually, but I don't have experience with
Yeah.
that to know how trustworthy
Yeah.
it is.
Given that most of us probably have access to better things at our university,
Yeah.
I don't know why you'd want to use that for
Right.
your, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
except dark storage, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, so we have here in this work session, we have plenty of time. We have until 3:15. 3:15, is that right? What's the next item on the?
3:15, we have a break at.
Yeah, so we have until 3:15 to do these questions for your data management plan. So there are 10 questions here and 2 paragraphs worth of guidance. So go ahead and we'll walk around as usual.
Testing, testing. All right. So welcome back from that long break. I noticed some people writing and some people sleeping, and all of those are important things. This is like drinking from the hose, and so you can only take in so much, and you need to, refresh. Now we're going to talk about the very exciting topics of documentation and metadata. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So this wheel that we have here is, we didn't really explain it at the beginning. This is basically the data, research data life cycle, or research data management life cycle. So the life cycle of research and data. And it's circular because you keep doing it over and over again. I didn't create this. There's all kinds of graphics out on the internet about the research data life cycle, and you can look it up. And this was one that Lauren's team at the University of Pittsburgh had created for some slides. And so it was a CC BY license, and so we kind of copied it. And we're at the prepare stage. So we haven't been using this diagram for every single session, and that was more just kind of a slight lack of planning on our part for not like trying to be consistent throughout. So I apologize for that, but it's here, and just know that this exists, and some literature that you might read will refer to the data management lifecycle, and this is just one representation of the data management lifecycle. So we're in the prepare your data phase. So as you're collecting your data, you need to be thinking about documentation for that data. And I've already had a conversation with one table in here today about the documentation, but this is basically any sort of digital analog document that's written or recorded, online or offline, that provides important information about your research. So examples of documentation will include user guides, README files. Who's old enough to remember what a README file is? Let me rephrase it. Yeah, not everybody knows what a README file is. So I do presentations on data management to undergrads and young graduate students, and most people have no idea what I'm talking about when I say a README file. So I'm glad. Does anybody here not know what a README file is? Anybody? Nobody wants to admit it, right? No. But at any rate, other types of documentation might include white papers, FAQs, frequently asked questions, protocols. So any kind of experiment that you run, you need to include the protocol of that experiment with the data, because the data means nothing without the protocol. Manuals, lab books, hardware and software configuration. So if you were using a special software to create spectrograms, for example, you need to document the settings, the configuration of that software, because that's very important if somebody wants to later recreate that or use it for their own analysis of some sort. Any kind of workflow, especially if you're working with a team, you need to document your team's workflow. Who does what? Who's responsible for what? All of this is part of the documentation. Does anybody have any examples of documentation that I haven't mentioned yet? No. Okay, so one thing that I learned when I was first starting out doing field work was to create or keep a daily work log. So it was basically a journal, but instead of writing, you know, like what I had for breakfast and what the weather was, I was writing the elicitation tasks I did that day and what new discoveries I made in the language and who I worked with and the places I went and that sort of thing. So it's important to keep such a work log. And then when you submit your data to an archive, they might want that work log to go hand in hand with your data, and they might not. Some people might not want to turn their work log in because it's very easy to let your work log turn into your diary. Don't let that happen unless, you know, you just want all your business out there. Yawn, right? Documentation. This is so boring to create, but it is so crucial to your research data. You really need an overview of your project. So this project that you're creating here, you're creating a data management plan for the project. Now, this documentation of the project, this project proposal, could be part of your data set that gets turned into the archive, because that will help someone in the future reuse your data. The methodology that you used for various components of your project is very, very important. You should have your methodology in your proposal, in the body of the proposal itself. So methodology is crucial, as I mentioned before, protocols, work logs, logbooks, and then lists. So anytime you're collecting a word list and you've got it recorded, include this, like some sort of documentation of what that list was, written documentation, and why that list, what was crucial about the words on that list. Document daily, or at least as often as necessary. Every time you create a new list, or you create a new protocol, or you create a new workflow, you need to document it right away. If you wait a week or a month, that turns into 2 weeks and 2 months and 2 years and 10 years, and then you've forgotten what it was. Yeah.
And, you know, I've had many experiences of thinking, well, I'll never forget this.
And you always forget it. Yes, yes, exactly. Yep. So it's very important to take even just a few minutes at the end of your day to at least document enough notes that you yourself could go back and figure out what you did, and then maybe somebody else would be able to as well. All right, so metadata. This is like the word that's all over the place nowadays. Metadata are data about data, and that's so helpful. Metadata is structured information. It describes the data, explains the data, locates the data, represents the data in some way. The metadata, good metadata, makes it easier for your data, your research data, to be discoverable, retrievable, usable or reusable, manageable. People can understand it and cite it if you have good metadata. If you don't have good metadata, it's very hard to cite the data. And metadata is best done by the data creator or collector at the time of creation. Because again, you're not going to remember later who that speaker was or the day that you recorded that speaker. I have a little video here. First, I'll say that there are different types of metadata. I forgot to say that on the last slide. Oh, I missed a slide. Metadata can be descriptive, administrative, structural, and there was one more and I can't remember what it is. But descriptive metadata is used for discovery. This is for identification, for retrieval. It's going to say the names of the people involved in the research, the languages, the dates, the keywords, the genre, all of that sort of thing is descriptive metadata. And I have a little video here that one of my graduate students made.
Hey there, the topic of this ILA tutorial is metadata. So you're probably wondering, what is metadata? Metadata is quite literally metadata. It's data that describes other data. Examples of metadata for ILA include things such as research and media languages, research participants, recording location, date of creation, media type, and research context, among others. Another important question is, why is metadata important? Metadata is important because it provides contextual information about collections and data collected by researchers. Metadata also allows for collections, research output, materials, or datasets to be found quickly and easily by researchers and other users. Now you're probably wondering, what metadata does ILA collect? ILA collects 4 different types of metadata: contributor, collection, resource, and media file. Contributor metadata is the information about people who contributed to the research. This data is provided by depositors but entered by ILA staff and cannot be edited by depositors. Collection metadata is contextual information about the project or projects that contributed to the collection. This data is provided by the depositor, and then ILA staff will create the collection, but this data can be edited by the depositor later. A collection must contain a minimum of 1 resource. Resource metadata is the information about a recording session or speech event. This data is created and edited by the depositors. A resource must contain a minimum of 1 media file. Media file metadata is information about the media files contained in the resource packages. This data is also created and edited by depositors. Media files can be images, audio, video, PDF, text, or XML files. By now, you probably want to know, how should I collect this metadata? ILA collects required metadata needed to add contributors, collections, resources, and media files through a downloadable spreadsheet that is found on the ILA website. Depositors need to just fill out the form with as much relevant metadata as they can. Remember, the more metadata you as a depositor add to your collection at ILA, the easier it is for researchers to find your work.
So that was a video that's very specific to ILA, but it gives you an idea of the types of metadata that you need to be thinking about as you plan to put your data into an archive. So this is the data that you need to collect at the time that you are doing your research. I'm actually going to go back a slide. So that was mostly descriptive metadata, as I said before. So it describes the data in some way. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I fell out of presenter mode. Okay. There's also technical metadata, and these are the technical details about the files that you're creating. You know, it might be the file size or sampling rates, recording equipment, that sort of thing. All of the really technical information that went into creating this file, programs and that sort of thing. I wish I had a slide advancer so I can do it from afar. There's also administrative metadata, and this is the metadata that explains how the files should be managed. And so some intellectual property information would fall under the category of administrative metadata. Restriction information. So I have an example here of ILA has 4 different restriction levels, and this is just a sample. It's not really relevant. I just wanted to throw a picture on the slide. But the restrictions and restricted data, this is something that you need to be thinking about as you're collecting the data. Do you need to mark on your spreadsheet or however you're collecting your metadata that this file needs to be restricted for some reason? And so that is a piece of metadata that you need to collect and think about at the time of collection. Structural metadata is how the data relate to each other. So in the video, we have a researcher's collection. And inside the collection, there are resources that are built around, they're basically bundles of related data sets. And then there are individual files. And so in this slide, this is just a screenshot of the, some of the descriptive metadata about this file, which is found here. And then the structural metadata is shown here in the breadcrumbs. So how this file, this file relates to this set of data in this collection. And so that's structural metadata. It's so far away. Okay, I'm going to stay close to here now. So what information is needed for data to be read and interpreted in the future? We've already kind of been over this. So in terms of the documentation, you must specify the programs that you've used, the title and the version. Is it proprietary or is it open source? What settings did you use? Filters, templates, anything relevant for your study that you had to set up yourself or make a decision about. Your methodology, so a really detailed description of what you did so that you or someone else can reproduce it or understand it at another time. Any experiments that you did, you need to name your tools. Some tools even have ways you can cite them, and so you need to properly cite any kind of tools or published protocols that you're using. All of this needs to go into the documentation. Metadata is more like who, what, when, and where. Your documentation is more of the why. The metadata is the who, the what, the when, and the where. Now, the who is very important because we talked about the intellectual property rights and the need to make sure that we attribute some sort of authorship to everyone involved in the process. So you might have been the researcher who conceived of the project, but you might have hired people to go out and do some sort of language survey in a variety of communities. And those people need to be attributed in some way in the metadata. And then the speakers of the language who answered the questions of the surveyor, that person needs to be attributed. Somebody who later then transcribed that data needs to be attributed in the data. And then any translators should get attributed. And I'm sure that you could think of everybody and their brother, in some way who you could attribute, make some sort of attribution in your data. Now, different archives will have different author requirements. So some institutional repositories only have a field to put author or data creator. And you might have to find another way to put in other people's names. Again, you'll have to talk to your archive about how they do things. The title of the data set is relatively important. In ILA, there are many data sets that have these just wacky titles that are not informative at all. And the file names are one thing. File names are supposed to be some sort of concise bit of information, but the title of your data set should be a little bit more informative than your file name. And so keep that in mind as you bundle your data into some sort of grouping or organized set to turn into the archive. When is also an important thing to consider. So the actual date that you pushed record versus the date that you did your transcription versus the date you did, some other sort of analysis. Go ahead and keep track of all those dates because different archives will have different date fields where you can put that information in. And of course, where the data was created is crucially important, especially when we're talking about copyright. So if you made a recording in somewhere in Africa, let's say Cameroon, you're going to have to respect Cameroonian copyright law. And then you went home to your home institution in the US, and that's where you did some transcription or some translation work. Then that work is going to fall under US copyright law, right? So you need, this is the hardest step, I think, is remembering where you did what. So that information needs to go into your metadata also. Do we have any questions so far? Good.
How much can you rely on metadata created, recorded by your equipment?
Ooh, we're going to get to that, yeah. Yes, so that's actually this slide that I just came to. So the data, like data stamps on cameras and that sort of thing, are good as long as you remember to update the date, right? Yeah. So make sure that it's actually the data is correct on the camera or the video equipment before you actually start recording. Now, if the date needs to be, if the data is sensitive in some way and the date will affect that sensitivity, then you might want to turn off your timestamp. I know that some of the database programs can also have a timestamp option for every entry, and so those are very helpful because when you're working in a particular database for many, many years and you want to know when was the last time I edited a particular record, that data stamp, you need to check and see, is my data stamp the date I created the record or the date I changed the record? I edited the record, or can you have both? And so it's a good idea to keep track of both. Now, the reliability, you know, all technology is only as reliable as the person who's using it. So just know what your equipment is and know how to use it. There are a variety of ways to keep track of your metadata. So on the video, it mentions a spreadsheet that Isla asks everyone to use to submit their data to the archive. Other ways to track your metadata are in text files. Some field linguistic guides still say to carry a notebook and a pencil around with you everywhere you go to record the metadata. And sometimes that's the only way you can get your metadata down at the time. You just need to then remember to go and put it into whatever digital program you're using to track your metadata, whether it's a spreadsheet or whether it's one of these programs like Say More or Toolbox or Arbol or SimDMaker or even FileMaker Pro, Access, you know, Microsoft Access database. I mean, you can create you can keep metadata in a variety of different ways. It's just really important that you be consistent and always collect it. And then the thing that I did not get on these slides is that you need to know what the metadata standards are for your field. So if you are working in, actually maybe I did, here we go. I did get it on there, yes, I just didn't remember. So if you're working in language documentation, a lot of people say they're using MD metadata. That's the very bottom bullet here, the ISLE Metadata Initiative. And ISLE is actually the one above it, International Standard for Language Engineering. And these were metadata standards that were kind of built off of Dublin Core. So Dublin Core, the very top one, is a very standard metadata schema that's used in libraries all over the world. But it can't talk about language in all the different ways that linguists want to talk about language. So Dublin Core basically has one language field. And when we're, as linguists, we're frequently dealing with what's the national language? What is the language of this community? What other languages are spoken in this community? What are the languages that are spoken on this media file? Because if you have two American researchers working in Africa, somewhere in Africa where they're speaking French as a contact language, and then there are maybe 3 different languages spoken in this community, you could have 5, 6, 7 languages all on the same media file, but Dublin Core doesn't have an easy way to deal with that. And so in the early 2000s, several linguists and computational linguists got together and devised this international standard for language engineering, the ISLE metadata schema, that allows us to talk about language in a variety of different ways, like media language, native language, standard language, national language, community language, all kinds of different ways. Other types of metadata that you see now are MODs and MADs from the Library of Congress. And I've never ever heard anybody say metadata object description schema or metadata authority description schema. Everybody just says MODs or MADs. Because most of the software that handles archival collections, digital archival collections nowadays, use MODs, MADs, and or Dublin Core. And so these are the main metadata standards that you will need to name in your DMP. And this is where you would want to consult with your archive to find out what kind of wording they recommend for the metadata standards. So if you have an archive in mind, you're going to be collecting data, knowing that you're putting it into that archive, talk to the archivist, find out what their metadata standards are, and that's what you need to put into your proposal. Now, if their metadata standards just don't quite meet what is the norm in your field, for example, if you're putting your data in a institutional repository at your university that's using Dublin Core, and they've only got one field for language, then you might have to put a lot of extra information in the description field about all the different ways languages are used in the context where you're collecting it. But you know, your metadata standard needs to be addressed in your DMP somewhere. And the best way to do it is to talk to the librarian or the archivist where you're going to put your data. Yes?
You put things like so-and-so was really uncomfortable, or there was a government worker who was standing near us making sure that the propaganda was being said. Like, how much do you metadata?
Right, yeah. That's the type of thing that I would have put in my work log. However, if it affected the quality, the content of the data, if you don't think you got the data that you would have gotten otherwise because of this, you might want to put a note in there. But you also have to take the situation of your community into account. So you don't want to say anything in your metadata that could harm the community in any way. Yeah. So that sometimes it's a question of, you know, do you say it in public or do you say it in private, right? So publicly saying it in the archive is one thing, and saying something to your close colleagues who you know are going to be using the data set is something else. Okay. And it's a very tricky line to draw. Does that make sense? Yep. So for example, in a place where I did field work, there was a language change in progress happening, and the community was split between Catholics and Protestants, and the sound change had happened in the Catholic community but not in the Protestant community. But I have never said that in print, and I probably never will. But it's the type of thing, except I'm being recorded now.
Sorry,
I'll have to edit that out, yeah. But I didn't say where.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Yeah. Let's see what the next slide says. Okay, this is a working session. So before we get to the working session, do you all have any other questions?
I just wanted to reiterate something. That
yes.
This discussion about metadata is kind of putting the cart before the horse, because really you don't have to investigate the details of IMD and Dublin Core and MADs and MODs and decide for yourself what's best. What you're going to do is actually find an archive first,
yes.
Ask which one they use, and they'll instruct you. So don't feel like you have to become extremely familiar with these libraries.
Right, exactly.
We're just doing it in this order.
But the metadata standards is something that you must address in your data management plan. And so it's difficult to address the metadata standards that you're going to be using if you don't know what archive you're going to be putting your data into. Yes?
Do they be separate or integrated? I mean, if you have files and recordings, do we have to adapt metadata standards and put them in the beginning or at the end of each file, or they should be in a separate file?
And so the question was, do you need to integrate your metadata into your files themselves, yes, or track your metadata separately? Yes. And the answer is you can do either. So there are these programs that track your metadata. I personally prefer a spreadsheet because I can make the column heading anything I want it to be, and I track my metadata there. But when I'm doing recording, I usually try to record as much metadata at the beginning of the recording as I can. So back in the analog days, this was a really simple and elegant solution to how to collect your metadata. So at the beginning of every recording, you say, you know, my name is such and such, and I'm talking to so-and-so, and we're in such and such place, and we're speaking such and such language, and today is such and such date. And you put as much metadata into that introduction as you can. Well, nowadays, everything is digital, right? And so every time you push pause or stop, you're writing a new track. So Are you going to say that at the beginning of every single track? Well, yes, you should. If you're being consistent, you need to say it at the beginning of every track. Back in the days when I was in the field, you know, we had tape recorders, so we said it at the very beginning of the tape recording, and then we didn't have to say it again until after we pushed stop and it was another day and we were talking to a new person. But with a digital recording, it's very easy for those files to get separated, right? So you might record that header on day one at the beginning of the day, and then you might record or push pause, let's say, 10 times. Now you've got 10 files, but only the first one in that series has that metadata recorded at the beginning of it, right? And so that's why I think it's very important to get into the practice of writing down the metadata either in a spreadsheet if you have a computer with you, or in your notebook, or whatever the case may be, or get in the habit of recording that header every single time you've pushed stop or pause. Yeah.
You can also record that metadata header post hoc.
Yes.
Use software.
Yes. Yeah, and that's something that, you know, this is kind of like your data cleaning. We didn't even really talk about data cleaning. We talked about data backing up and recording your metadata, but this might be one of the tasks that you do on a daily basis, is stick in your little recorded header at the beginning of every track with Audacity or whatever it is you're using. Yeah. Yes.
But if you're de-identifying, you probably need versions without that stuff in it too.
Right, if you're de-identifying, right.
Versions of it where the names aren't said and...
If I were, so I didn't have to deal with de-identified data. Andrea or Lauren, have you all had to deal with this? So I don't have like quick and easy solutions, but my gut instinct is that I wouldn't even record it in the first place. I would keep track of it in my metadata spreadsheet, and then I would keep that metadata spreadsheet separate from the actual files.
You could say the date and that sort of stuff at the beginning, but not say the names of the
Exactly.
participants. Just write that down, and then
Right.
if the name happens to come up in conversation, you can go back and delete that more easily.
Right, and you are the best person to do that. So don't expect your archivist to be able to go back and de-identify your data for you. That's not the archivist's responsibility. That's yours. You don't know how many times I get asked to do that. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, this was an easy session. So we have a exercise here that says, imagine that 15 or more years from now, someone comes upon the data from your project in an archive. And with that in mind, answer these questions for yourself, thinking about your project. And I'm not going to read the questions to you, but really think about 15 years from now. Nobody knows, well, okay, so you're a famous linguist or whatever, but no. Assume that you've forgotten the details of your project, your dissertation supervisor has retired, all of your peers are gone, nobody remembers the details of this project, but you want your data to be reusable. So now think about that. Think about this future person and what they could glean from your data, okay? And you can work together, you can work alone, there can be conversation, we'll circulate. So it seems like we're stopping for the day. Is that what we're doing? Does anybody want to just shout out any issues that came up, or? No. Okay, so I have a sample. Did somebody raise their hand? I'm sorry.
Yeah, is there a gold standard for, like if we've got all these little cassette tapes from 1975 and we want to digitize them? Because I do have something in our Digital Humanities Lab which is, you know, something, it's in real time, of course.
Yes.
But that's fine because then you're listening to it.
Yes.
And you can be making notes on what's on the tape and registering metadata and stuff. So is there any gold standard for that, or any best good enough practices?
But I'm not quite sure what you're for what, for collecting the metadata or for doing the digitization.
Just the digitization.
Yes. Yes. And unfortunately, I can't just spout them off. Andrea, do you remember what they are? Every time we mention sampling rates in the slides, we've put the best practice sampling rate in the slide. Yeah, so you would want to set your software to sample at a certain hertz and 44.1. 16-bit, yeah. And you can even go up to 24-bit, right? That's, yeah, right.
And what I would have in our Digital Humanities Center would be probably good, right?
Yes.
The digitization.
Yes.
You still have to check the settings though, because somebody could set it at something bad.
Right. So get whoever the lab attendant is to help you set all your settings. Yeah.
Right. And I bought a Google, like a big hard drive to put all that stuff on.
Oh, good. Which you'll replace in 5 years.
Well, some go up to 10 years now.
Okay, good.
They're really expensive.
So the announcement that I wanted to make is that I do have a sample data management plan that I will put in the Google folder, like right now, and so you can see it if you want to look at it. And we will put our heads together tonight, and we will write yet another sample data management plan. Oh, we have more homework. Okay. Great. All right. Well, thank you for your attention today, and we'll see you tomorrow.